Hey, AP Worlders. This is the second edition to the Industrial Revolution. So, a couple things. First, the Industrial Revolution had a large impact on the environment from a couple of different reasons. First, the extraction of the raw materials to feed the Industrial Revolution, such as oil and coal, took a big impact on the environment. Sewers and industrial waste emptied into rivers, turning them into poisonous cesspools. All right, like this political cartoon here, right, showing the people drinking from the water, right, with death. Smoke from the coal polluted the air, as you can see here, and caused respiratory illness. Some historians refer to this era as the age of man because man made things, and they're leaving their mark now on the environment and on the world. Right? This mark has affected the ecology, or the ecological, the atmospheric, and geological history of the Earth. The first Industrial Revolution, just to recap from last PowerPoint, it started with the innovation in the textile industry. And with the great breakthrough came when we had the coal-fired steam engine. After that, now we got ships, trains, and the machines could expand. They could move away from the waterways. In the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution would then spread to iron, steel, food processing, and construction. Early railroad. From there, we then had the second Industrial Revolution. This one focused on chemicals, electricity, precision machinery, the telegraph, telephone, rubber, printing, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and refrigeration. The continuous emergence of new techniques of production with the massive economic growth and the environmental impact it generated was big. Europe. Here's a map of Europe and places that industrialized. All right, so looking at the places in green, you see the areas that were industrialized. And then you see the importance of the coal, right, and the iron industry, textile industries, right? So looking at that map, you can see the areas in Europe, all right, and then eventually the railways that are going to come through. But Europe was an unlikely place for this Industrial Revolution to begin, all right, for three reasons. First, during the Middle Ages, they had little to no trade. So they had little to no intellectual exchange. Second, Europe was politically separated. All right, so you see all these different countries, the fact that they were separated. And third, they weren't the technological or intellectual leaders of the world prior to this time period. All right, there's many advances that were taking place in parts of Asia, like in China and India. All right, also the Islamic world was having a lot of advancements. So Europe was unlikely. But why did it happen in Europe, despite all those things? Two reasons. First, because they were politically separated, it's going to lead to a high level of competitiveness. And so the countries were trying to compete to be, better. So if one kind of invents something, the rest would try to even advance it even more, all right, due to that competitiveness. And second, the European monarchs had such a want for revenue that they would encourage more trade and innovation. All right, partly the reason why they wanted so much revenue was because of that competition, but they would encourage it. Another change due to the Industrial Revolution is the social, or society, all right, social classes. Previously, wealth was determined by the landowners. They would decline as urban wealth became more important. So as people became more wealthy from the Industrial Revolution, the wealth of the rural people, or the landowners, would go down. These new businessmen would buy country houses, they would obtain seats in government, and send their kids to universities. But a new class is going to develop, which is the middle class. These were the small businessmen, the doctors, the lawyers, the engineers, teachers, and other professionals. And the central value of the middle class was the idea of respectability, and it was a social status and a virtuous behavior. So if you acted respectable, you were supposed to act a certain way and obtain a certain social status. The women were now seen as homemakers in the middle class. They were wives, they were mothers, and were to create an emotional haven for their men away from the hustle and bustle of capitalism. Middle class women were now seen as a lady, and they were not ones who were supposed to work for profit. 70% or more of the people were the laboring class, all right, or under Marx's the proletariat. All right, and these were the factory workers and the farmers, or the miners, all right, construction workers. Women in this category would differ from the middle class women, all right. Many of the women in this proletariat or lower class had to work in the textile industry, and the textile industry liked to hire them because they could give them lower wages, or they could serve as domestic servants, working in their homes doing laundry or sewing. All right, so it's a good pyramid. All right, the bourgeoisie, the people at the top, these were the owners of the factories. All right, and so Marx's theory was that the proletariat would rise up against these bourgeoisie people. All right. Speaking of Karl Marx and socialism, that's one of the lasting significance of the protesting that's going to take place by the laboring class, was this idea of Karl Marx socialism. After spending much of his time in Britain, Karl Marx experienced the brutal conditions of the Industrial Revolution, and his analysis led him to the conclusion that the industrial capitalism was an unsustainable system, doomed to collapse, right? That the proletariat would rise up against the bourgeoisie eventually, right? He felt that there would be a revolution, and eventually it would lead to a classless society, ending the conflict between the rich and the poor. And he would inspire socialist movements of workers and intellectuals throughout Europe. All right, here's a good chart to kind of separate the two. I didn't really put this on your Cornell sheet, but I suggest you guys, take this in your notes, or make sure you guys notice the difference between the two. All right, with a little bit of review from last year when you guys were in economics. All right, but under capitalism, you have private ownership, and they believe competition brings out the best. All right, of people and the businesses. All right, also that competition would give you the good prices. Everyone works for his own wealth. All right, and the government doesn't interfere much, only in situations where laws have been broken. All right, now if you look at the other side, socialists, this is where it's going to be state-owned, and they believe that cooperation is the best way for people to coexist. All right, so we're not competing against each other, but we're all working together for the common good. All right, everyone works for wealth, and it's going to be distributed equally to everyone, so that way you won't get the gap between rich and the poor. All right, so this is a good chart to make sure you guys have. All right, another form of protest were from the Luddites. All right, early 19th century English workmen who destroyed industrial machines as a form of protest. Today, the term Luddite means someone who rejects technology or other modern ideas. All right, and then the second lasting significant social protest of the laboring class was the idea of unionization and people forming unions. All right, workers would unite in these factories to try to improve their working conditions and wages. Europe's Industrial Revolution also led to a mass migration, both internally and around the globe. First, internally, people would move from the countryside to the cities to work in the factories. Globally, 20% of the population of Europe would move to the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere during this time. They were pushed by poverty, a growing population, and displacement of the small farmers and artisans due to the big farms and the factories. They were going to be pulled by demand for labor, availability of land, and cheap transportation. For many, it didn't work out, and almost 7 million would return to Europe from these new places. Some areas would become settler colonies, or areas where natives would take over by conquest and acquisition of their lands and disease, similar to the exploration unit that we did. Two examples that became settler colonies were Australia and New Zealand. Australia, initial settlers were unwanted British people or convicts that they sent out there. The Americas would also receive a majority of these immigrants, or a lot of these immigrants. All right, but out of the Americas, the United States would receive the majority of these. And many would be drawn to the U.S. for their cheap land during like the Western expansion out west of the United States, and also the industrial jobs that the Latin America couldn't offer. All right, so that's everything for the Industrial Revolution. Next lecture we'll look at Japan and Russia's attempts to industrialize.